Welcome, everybody, to the Flowing Health podcast. I'm very excited today to have a guest all the way over from the States, Ed Frauenheim, who's written this incredible book with his friend Edward Adams, Reinventing Masculinity. I think it's so relevant and needed in these modern times, both for men in daily life, but also for the business environment. So welcome, Ed.
Thanks very much, Alessandro.
Yeah, and I've loved the book. I only bought it a few weeks ago, went straight through it. It's covered in notes and bits of paper, and we're going to just dive a little bit deeper into the liberating power of compassion and connection, which I think is not just for men, but for society in general. So how did you come about? Maybe tell us a little bit about the story, how you came about to writing this with the other Ed. And I love the fact that you're both called Ed, and as you as you said in the book, two Eds are better than one. So I'm hoping on the next podcast I can have two Eds and myself.
That sounds great, Alessandro. Sure, happy to talk a bit about the origins. There are personal, professional, and even public interest reasons for me behind this book, Alessandro. On the personal side, I have struggled to fit into these man rules, you might say, what we ended up calling confined masculinity. That is to say, I was skinny growing up. I wasn't super strong or buff. You're supposed to just win. I struggled in competitive arenas and some of the contests we had at school or in business, even in the work world. You're supposed to rise up and lead a big organization of people. Well, I've managed one person for one day. I may have the shortest management career in history. And so a lot of these expectations have been very difficult and painful for me as a guy. And that I've been reflecting on that over the last decade or so. And then professionally, I have studied workplace culture for most of my life as a writer, as a journalist, and then as a researcher at Great Place to Work, which is a consulting firm that puts together the annual Fortune 100 Best Companies to Work For list. And so I got to see some of the best workplace cultures and leaders in the world. And what I noticed is that men have had to show up differently as we've gotten into the later part of the 21st century, where it's not as effective to be kind of that top-down commander, barking boss. They've needed to show more empathy, more emotional intelligence, share power more. So men were having to show up differently at work. That's that professional piece. And then from a public interest perspective, I do believe that we need to reinvent the way we show up as men to solve global problems, whether it's violent conflict, war, climate change, issues of terrorism and cooperation around disease. These are complex problems that need more cooperation, where men have typically gravitated toward conflict and competition as opposed to connection and collaboration. So for those three reasons, I was drawn to this book project and was lucky to find my partner, Ed Adams, who's got great background in psychology. And we sort of brought together the psychological and the workplace trends to pull this book together and publish it a few years ago.
Brilliant. And it's a great mix. I think you two, he's brought a lot of even the artwork in it. I just love the artwork in it, like with the 5 C's we'll come on to later. And then, the way you marry the two things together is just beautifully, flows very well. So tell us a little bit about, I know many of us might know what that means, but, this idea of confined masculinity, because I can really feel it, even just saying that word, I feel I'm squashed. And maybe I'm Italian, brought up Catholic, already squashed by the church, by the rules, by being in a Catholic school, so masculinity, from an early age for me was already confined. Tell me a little bit more about, how you see that.
Sure. And I appreciate your time about the squashedness of a Catholic upbringing. I also was brought up Catholic and have a sense of what you mean there. We chose this term because we thought it really captures the sense of limitation that men experience growing up in much of the world, especially maybe in the West. We also knew that the term toxic masculinity was out there, and we really did not want to use that term. We don't think that men are inherently poisonous or deadly. It's more that the range of choices we've been given as we've been socialized is quite narrow. And some of those limitations boil down to being like a solo actor. You're supposed to be kind of a rock, an island, independent, super self-reliant. You're also supposed to be dominant and battling others to rise to the top. And you're supposed to be stoic in the sense of not showing emotion, not expressing vulnerability or fear or sadness, and also joy. So pretty much the only emotion we're allowed to have is anger, or maybe contentment. But there's a whole range of experiences, ways of relating, as well as roles we can play that have been kind of kept from us by these confines of what we call confined masculinity.
Yeah, and I think probably that leads to, certainly has led to, I mean, I'm in the UK, there's, isolation, high suicide rates, among men. Men don't have that many forums in which either to express, or it's beginning to be more encouraged now, thank goodness. And there are men's groups and the Mankind Project, and I've been doing this for a couple of years with the Mankind Project, and it's very moving when men get together, but it's still rare. But the good news is, in the back of your book, you've got some great resources, places to connect, things to do, resources to explore. So I would tell people, recommend, we have a look at this. Loads of great resources there. So from confined masculinity, and I love the way you don't call it liberated, but liberating masculinity, which is the ing verb, action verb. So should we go on to what is liberating masculinity? And it's tricky as well. It's not just an easy step, sideways. I think quite a lot needs to fit into place. So let's unpack that a bit, maybe.
Sure. We chose the liberating version of that word, as you said, the gerund for grammar nerds, as opposed to liberated masculinity, because we were seeing it as an action, as a process, and that it's also referring not only to men freeing themselves from those confines, but freeing others, because men have so much authority and power in the world. So when men can break out of those narrow roles and ways of relating, so they're not just the protector, the provider, the procreator. Those are kind of the standard ones we have, but you can also be a caregiver. You can be a spiritual seeker. You could be someone who is more ready to sort of be a friend to others, as opposed to a combatant, because that's, as you pointed out, there's so much isolation. When we see these additional roles and ways of connecting with others, that does do wonders for our health, our happiness, our satisfaction as men. And it also, we believe, liberates those around us, our children, our spouses, our partners, because they now can have a more emotionally available father, say. They can have a more collaborative colleague who's able to, see the working together not as a form of loss, where you're not getting ahead, but rather we don't all have to be in a stuck in win-lose games all the time, zero-sum games. So there's a lot of good that ripples out from men liberating themselves from those narrow confines we talked about before.
Yeah, and I think the two words that jump out, we've already mentioned compassion and connection, but actually the 5 C's we can maybe come to, which I love Ed's drawing. I mean, my Qigong master does a lot of Chinese calligraphy, and this is very powerful. I mean, it looks simple, but it's very powerful sort of image, the 5 C's. So shall we just go into the 5 C's that help men to get to this liberating masculinity?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Alessandro. The 5 C's are curiosity, courage, compassion, connection, and commitment. And as you put it, we see these as the practices to engage in, to make that shift to basically a bigger way of living, a fuller life for yourself as a man. And I love that Ed's drawings as well, as you put it, and that one shows the kind of the fertileness of this sense of growing, evolving as a guy.
Yeah.
And it does kind of start, we think, with curiosity, with asking more questions. And what struck us as we talked about this one, Alessandro, is that all people are curious. All children ask questions like, why is the sky blue? Like, how come an airplane doesn't fall out of the sky? But a lot of guys are kind of beaten into losing their curiosity by the time they're in their 12, 13, 14s, because you want to be the smartest guy in the room. There's that pressure to be the best and to know it all. It kind of really undermines and forces us to get rid of our native curiosity. So part of this process is reappropriating that, or re-embracing curiosity and asking questions about everything, but including what kind of life do you want to have as a man, as a human being. Yeah. So that's the first one. And it's related to the second one of courage, because to ask some of those questions does take some guts, because you're going to be going up against some of the viewpoints that to be vulnerable, to say, wonder if maybe I can be more expressive emotionally, cry, for example, is going to make me mocked by some of my mates, and or by women too, that have a lot of these attitudes that men are supposed to be a certain way. So there's a courage to entering this new terrain, if you will. And the word courage is great because it has to do with the heart, right? The origin of courage is cor, or Latin for heart, which leads to that compassion one. Can we start demonstrating and expressing compassion? And this is not to say that men are not compassionate. They have that, even in the older confined masculinity, there's been a lot of compassion in men's actions of like providing for a family, sacrificing themselves. But what we're calling for here is to be articulate about it and to be expressive about it, so that you're reaching out and offering your care, your sympathy, your empathy for folks that are suffering, starting with yourself. You and I were talking about this earlier, that men hold on to a lot of pain that ends up getting expressed in unhealthy ways if we don't give ourselves a break, forgive ourselves, care for ourselves. And one of the ways it goes into the next C is connecting, building relationships. We know now from the science that humans are social beings, and we need friendships. We need loving, supportive bonds. But men have often consider those not part of what a real man is. We're supposed to be self-sufficient, and there's a lot of homophobia that prevents us from connecting. We've been taught that homosexuals is like the worst thing you could possibly be as a man. An awful attitude that, thankfully is diminishing, but many men struggle to have friendships, and we know that that's a critical factor for health and living a happy old age into an old age, and extending your lifespan. And finally, this commitment one is this is not a one and done process, as you were speaking about it as well, Alessandro. You need to really devote yourself to asking these questions, showing that courage, being compassionate, self-compassionate, connecting. It's a life journey and not just a destination, even though it will take you to a much better place, we believe.
Yeah, beautiful. I love the way you explain those, how they flow into each other. And I think curiosity is, I teach Qigong, and one of the things in Qigong is just to always be like a beginner and be curious about what does keep us alive. Oh, it's an energy, it's something up there. Let me connect again today. I did it yesterday. Let's see what happens today. And I know that this nourishes me. It connects me with myself on a deeper level. If I have something emotional going on, I can connect with that. It's a self, like you said, it's like a self-compassion as well. I'm doing this for myself, but by working on myself, I'm also able to connect better with other people. And I think it reflects out. But I just love these five C, words, which are so powerful, and how they fit together. So thanks for explaining that. And one thing I love about this book, I can just show people at the end of each chapter, you have the 5 C's, things to ponder and do, on the 5 C's. So they're kind of questions. Just for example, from a low of 1 to a high 10, where do you think you are on the continuum between confined and liberating masculinity? And that could take an hour to just reflect, maybe journal on it, work it out, but they're really, every chapter has these questions on the 5 C's, and I think it keeps us engaged. It's not just with picking up information and we might use it one day, so I love the way you've done it. It's quite interactive, if I can call it that.
Thank you. What has struck me about these 5 C's over time, Alessandro, is that I think you stated it earlier as well. They are so important, but they're often disregarded or ignored by men. And some of my old high school and middle school friends who have heard some of my discussion about these ideas have reached out to me and said, for example, I just never connected with people, and it was a function of the kinds of man role models that I saw growing up. And this one friend has a trouble in his marriage, trouble with some of the relationships with their kids, and it broke my heart to hear this. And also, we don't even notice it among our friends sometimes because it's so unspoken, and the need to sort of be able to talk about, say, when our children are having kind of anxiety attacks or mental health challenges. I'm thinking of another friend and their son having some challenges, and we just didn't make space to be compassionate to each other historically. So I'm hoping that these 5 C's gives us a language and gives men some permission to think and act in some new ways.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's so much around, mental health, especially since the pandemic, and a lot of men maybe don't find it easy to either admit it or share it. But I've noticed when at least in the men's groups, we share quite deeply, we're all the same. We're all going through similar issues, but we think, oh, this is only me. I can't connect or mention this to others, or they'll think I'm weak. And one of the things I've noticed in the men's groups, and I hope this is going to come into society, more freely, is that a lot of the men say, I can never talk to my male friends about any of these things. So I'm really glad to be in this group. And it's like, I just hope, why not? Just open up, just say, look, I've been struggling with this, or, my son, my daughter, I share about, my family. And then people say, oh, my son had the same thing, or my daughter. And it's a way of connecting us to others as well. And then there's more support and compassion for each other as well.
Yeah, it's interesting and not surprising for you to talk about that point made, that I can't talk about these issues with my guy friends except in this men's group. And that was true for me for many years as well. And I'm really lucky that I fell in with some guy friends who we've been on a kind of a journey together to be more vulnerable. And it took decades for us to be a little bit more honest with each other and open about, some of the conflicts we've had with each other, say, or with what our, hopes and dreams and fears have been, especially around, say, the professional world. That's one place where I think guys can be more honest with each other. More recently, I've joined and created a men's group as well. And I'm experiencing what you're saying as well, just really deep connection that I'm grateful for. And I do have your hope that it'll happen more in society, because as I said, I mentioned being in contact with some old high school and middle school friends. I'm 55 now. And on a text thread, occasionally you do see some of this vulnerability and connection. A lot of it is about sports fandom. We're all Buffalo Bills football fans, hoping this year we'll get the Super Bowl. But it's a neat place of I found connection that goes deeper than maybe we did, when we were younger.
Yeah, definitely. It is. I can see it happening all the time. But the more we talk about it, and that's why it was great to share on LinkedIn, share about your book. And I noticed loads of people commented, were interested. And LinkedIn used to be a very stuffy sort of, platform. You only talk about business. It's all serious. And now people every day are talking about vulnerability, are talking about how we show up, about, the workplace and how to bring, all these elements, compassion, connection, self-awareness into leadership, which maybe brings us a little bit into, masculinity, reinventing masculinity at work. You've got a chapter or a couple of chapters on that. And I love some of maybe we could just touch a little bit on, masculinity in the workplace. I know you mentioned a little bit at the start.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really struck that this is ever clearer that men have to kind of show up differently if they're going to succeed and thrive, and also have they can have a better experience if they are willing to evolve some or basically expand, out of those confined beliefs and attitudes. We're in a world now and we put in the book that it's faster, flatter, and fairness focused. Like things are moving quicker with change and the pace of business. You're also seeing organizations that are spreading authority out more. They have to listen to people on the front lines to be able to move quickly enough as part of that reaction to speed. And there's a lot of concern around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the past Me Too movements and the Black Lives Matter movements. All this is calling on guys to show up differently, especially white men, especially heterosexual white men like myself. The old school approach left men often rigid, cold, and isolated, and kind of clueless. You're unaware of their privilege in a world that's now calling for agility, warmth, and connection, as well as a consciousness of the ways we've had some advantages as guys. So we have to be more willing to listen to others and to share authority and not act as that commander in chief if we're a leader, say, but rather kind of distribute the decision making to those that are in the front lines of the organization. And it's a time to acknowledge that we have often had benefits that allowed us to get to where we were, even if we worked hard, and a time to kind of really advocate for others to have growth opportunities as well. So I think it is changing, and there's a lot of hope, but there's also a lot of resistance from men around these issues. You get the term like that gets put as a negative term, like we're just a woke corporation, when to me there's a lot of benefits and promise to being more aware and more awake to the limitations of the past.
Yeah, how interesting. And I do you know the poet David Whyte? Does he ring a bell?
I think so. I think I know the name, but please.
He lives in Canada. He's British, but he does a lot of work with leadership in organizations. And during lockdown, I did a whole leadership course with him, and WHYTE. And he talks about robust vulnerability. I love that term. Mm-hmm. I mean, we know about vulnerability, Brené Brown, I think you mentioned her in your book as well. But actually leaders feeling that they can be open and robust. And he talks about what are the conversations we need to stop having and what are the conversations we need to start having. It's like it's a different conversation in the workplace, and that it's not only safe but desirable for leaders to say to their teams, I have no idea what to do, you lot, let's get together. What ideas do you have? Whereas in the old days they would never admit that, they'd kind of hide away in their office. Yeah,
literally so, right? And close the door. I think you're onto something there, and as is David Whyte, the vulnerability piece is so important to building psychological safety. Like if you are not willing to kind of acknowledge you don't have all the answers, or that you're having a hard time, maybe your parent died or your sister's got cancer or something. If you don't show up in that authentic way and show some human, emotional difficulty, you can't help others feel safe doing that as well. And yet we know that when those teams experience psychological safety, which is to say people feel like they can be themselves more authentically and without being mocked or feel small for doing that, that's when those teams can perform really well. At Google and other places, we've seen the performance improvement from a psychologically safe team is dramatic. So this is not just a nice to have, or just get with the latest fad. This is actually a hard-nosed business reality. You've got to show up more vulnerably if you want to succeed. Yeah. Be more open. So look, I think we're maybe coming to the end, because I'd love to have another maybe part 2 with Ed Adams, and maybe we can go dive deeper into the two of you together, talking about both business and men in society, because I think there's so much in this book. But we'll put the links below. I just wanted to maybe end up on
because I was listening to a podcast today, and there's a man talking about how he's failed to empower his feminine side. And he was talking about masculine and feminine traits. It's not being manly or womanly, each of us. And I know from Qigong, we have the nourishing, the intuitive, the feminine is the earth. And the masculine, the controlling, the powerful is the heaven. So it's all about a kind of a balance. It's not about being, manly or womanly. And and any sort of practices, or obviously, I would recommend Qigong as an energy practice. I think you mentioned your wife practices it. It's just a brilliant health practice to bring us back to balance, no matter where we are. But any tips on how men can sort of tune in, reconnect with themselves, on a deeper level, apart from maybe the groups? Maybe you might talk about some of the groups as well.
Sure. What a great suggestion to get more kind of practical and embodied, embodied, Alessandro, as well. And word. I think even just some of the practices that are kind of standard now around breathing to avoid or get out of a state of anxiety that people talk about box breathing, like you take maybe 4 deep breaths where you're inhaling on a count of 5 and exhaling on a count of 7 or something like that, and you do it 4 times. These are activities that help ground us, to your point about the earth, that feminine energy. One of the ways that I've come to think about this idea of balance between the feminine and the masculine is the masculine symbol of the arrow in the circle. Yeah. And for so long, we've just, as men, focused on the arrow, that the assertiveness, the aloneness, the goal-orientedness, and we've lost sight of the circle, which is more that feminine energy of intuitiveness, connection, vulnerability, receptiveness. And we're cutting off half of our humanity if we don't embrace the circle and the body, the groundedness, the earth, feminine energy. So I like to think of us guys as having a lot of potential to just be more fully human. And it's not losing anything to kind of liberate and get into a liberating masculinity. It's actually gaining a lot. Yeah. Beautifully put. Thank you. And I'll put the resources below for your book. Is it? I know there's a group you mentioned. Do you want to mention your, the Great Place to Work, and tell us about that? Sure. Well, Great Place to Work is my former employer doing great work on great workplace cultures. I currently am a co-founder and a member of what we call the Teal team, which is interested in creating more soulful organizations. It's very aligned with this idea of a liberating masculinity, and folks are welcome to check us out there. We got quarterly meetings that people are invited to join and explore more of some of these concepts. TEAL. I'll put the link below, and there's a bit of information. There's a chapter on that, and I wrote down here a deep yearning for wholeness. I think that's what we're all looking for, isn't it? To be whole in ourselves, and to support each other, connect, and so I really appreciate you coming on today, and I do hope you'll be coming on again with Ed. So we have 2 Eds. That sounds great, Alessandro. May not be better than one, but you were brilliant. So I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much. Ed, my pleasure to be with you. And thank you so much for this incredible book. And I'll be sharing it, sort of far and wide. And look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks, Ed. Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.